High in the Colorado Rockies, where the air cuts like glass and civilization feels like a distant memory, Martha Henley stood at the old slave auction block that now served a different kind of desperation. Men lined up, broken by war, debt, or drink, selling themselves for labor contracts to anyone with cash. The crowd jeered when she bid on Jake Morrison, a one-armed Civil War veteran with haunted eyes and a reputation for trouble. What they didn't know was that Martha wasn't just any mountain woman. She was the daughter of the territory's most successful gold prospector, and she'd recognized something in Jake's scars that others missed. The same marks she'd seen on her father's secret maps, carved into trees near their family's abandoned cabin. That cabin held more than memories. Hidden beneath its rotting floorboards lay a fortune in gold, and a secret that powerful men had killed for once before. As Martha and Jake began rebuilding together, neither realized they were being watched or that their partnership would soon become a fight for survival. But what was Jake really hiding behind those haunted eyes? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auctioneer's gavel cracked against weathered wood, finalizing the transaction that would bind Jake Morrison to Martha Henley for the next 12 months. $50, more than anyone expected, certainly more than Jake thought he was worth. He flexed his remaining hand, feeling the familiar ache where his left arm used to be, and wondered what kind of work awaited him in these unforgiving mountains. Martha approached him through the dispersing crowd, her worn leather boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. She was smaller than he'd expected from her commanding presence at the auction, but there was steel in her grey eyes that reminded him of his commanding officers back in the war. Her dark hair was braided practically beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and her clothes spoke of someone accustomed to hard work rather than society gatherings. "Mr. Morrison," she said, extending a calloused hand. "I'm Martha Henley. I hope you're prepared for mountain living." Martha studied his face, noting the jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, the same distinctive pattern she'd memorized from her father's cryptic drawings. 3 parallel lines intersecting a curved mark, like branches growing around a bent nail. Her father had called them tree signs, markers left by those who came before, but seeing them carved into human flesh told a different story entirely. "We'll see about that," she replied. "My wagon's this way." The crowd parted as they walked, and Jake caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Crazy woman buying trouble. That one's got the devil in him. Won't last a week up there." He'd grown accustomed to such talk. The missing arm made people uncomfortable, but it was the look in his eyes that truly unsettled them. The war had taken more than just his limb. Martha's wagon was sturdy but simple, loaded with supplies that spoke of a long journey ahead. 2 mules stood patiently in their traces, their breath forming white clouds in the cold air. As Jake climbed onto the seat beside her, he noticed her glancing repeatedly at his scars, though she tried to be discreet about it. "Something bothering you, ma'am?" he asked. Jake's jaw tightened. "Shrapnel from an artillery shell at Bull Run." "Why?" "Curious is all. They're distinctive." The wagon lurched into motion, carrying them away from the ramshackle town and toward the towering peaks that dominated the horizon. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and the silence more profound. Jake found himself studying his new employer with equal curiosity. Most women who could afford to buy labor contracts were either wealthy widows or madams looking for protection. Martha Henley fit neither category. "What kind of work am I signing up for?" he asked, after an hour of steady climbing. "Rebuilding," Martha said simply. "My family's cabin needs repairs before winter sets in proper. Roof's half gone, walls are rotting, and the foundation's shifting. It's honest work, if you're willing. I can work with one arm, if that's what you're wondering. I figured you could, or I wouldn't have bid on you." She paused, then added, "My father always said a man's worth isn't measured by what he's lost, but by what he does with what remains." Jake nodded, appreciating the sentiment, even as he wondered about this father she spoke of in past tense. The wagon continued its ascent into the wilderness, carrying two strangers bound by contract toward a destination that promised more than either of them could imagine. The wagon lurched over another rut, and Marcus gritted his teeth as pain shot through his damaged leg. 3 hours of rough mountain trail had left him questioning whether he'd made the right choice, though he supposed choice was a generous word for what had happened back in Millbrook. The woman, Elena, she'd finally told him her name, drove with the easy confidence of someone who'd traveled these paths countless times. Her dark hair was pulled back severely under a weathered hat, and she hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since leaving town. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. "Where exactly are we headed?" Marcus finally asked, his voice hoarse from dust and disuse. "My place," Elena replied without turning around. "Another hour, maybe 2. The mountain air grew thinner as they climbed, pine trees crowding the narrow path on both sides. Marcus had fought in deserts and plains, but these mountains felt different, older somehow, full of secrets. Every shadow seemed to hold watching eyes. "You ever going to tell me why you bid on me?" he pressed. "Real reason, not that nonsense about needing help with chores." Elena's shoulders tensed slightly. "Maybe I felt sorry for you. Try again." She pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face him fully for the first time since they'd left town. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray-green and unreadable. "You were in the 4th Cavalry, weren't you? Under Colonel Morrison?" Marcus felt his blood turn cold. "How do you know that?" "I make it my business to know things." She studied his face carefully. "You were at Bear Creek Canyon, the massacre." The words hit him like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't spoken about Bear Creek to anyone, not even the army doctors who'd tried to piece him back together afterward. The official reports called it a tactical withdrawal, but the men who'd been there knew better. They'd walked into a trap, pure and simple. 37 good soldiers had died because someone had fed them false intelligence. "I don't talk about that," Marcus said quietly. "Maybe you should." Elena turned back to the reins. Maybe it's time someone did. They rode in heavier silence after that, winding higher into the mountains. The sun was beginning to sink behind the peaks when Elena finally guided the wagon off the main trail onto what looked like little more than a deer path. Marcus was starting to wonder if she was leading him somewhere to put a bullet in his head when the trees suddenly opened into a small clearing. The cabin that sat in the center was well built but modest, with smoke curling from the chimney and a small garden plot visible to one side. What caught Marcus's attention, though, were the other buildings scattered around the property: a barn, what looked like a workshop, and several smaller structures he couldn't quite make out in the fading light. "This is it," Elena said, climbing down from the wagon with practiced ease. "Home, sweet home." Marcus struggled to get down on his own, his bad leg nearly buckling when it hit the ground. Elena made no move to help him, which he appreciated. He'd had enough of people treating him like an invalid. "You can sleep in the barn tonight," she said, unhitching the horses. "Tomorrow we'll see about setting you up somewhere more permanent, assuming I decide to stay." Elena shot him a look that might have been amusement. "Where else you going to go? Back to Millbrook? They were ready to let you starve in that jail cell." She had a point. Marcus looked around the clearing again, noting details his soldiers' training automatically catalogued. Good defensive positions, clear sight lines, multiple escape routes. Either Elena was naturally cautious, or she had reason to expect trouble. "What kind of work exactly are you expecting me to do?" he asked. Elena finished with the horses and grabbed a rifle from under the wagon seat. "Tomorrow I'll show you the mine." "Mine?" "My father's claim. He disappeared 3 years ago, but I've been keeping it going." She started toward the cabin, then paused. "Fair warning, there are people who'd rather see this place abandoned. People who don't much like the idea of anyone digging around up here." "What kind of people?" "The kind that shot your leg to pieces at Bear Creek Canyon." Marcus felt the world tilt slightly. What the hell is that supposed to mean? But Elena was already walking away, the rifle cradled easily in her arms. "Get some rest," she called over her shoulder. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Marcus stood alone in the gathering darkness, questions spinning through his mind like buzzards. Whatever game Elena was playing, it was bigger than a simple mining claim, and somehow it was connected to the worst day of his life. The mountains seemed to lean in closer as full darkness fell, and Marcus had the distinct feeling he was being watched from the tree line. He limped toward the barn, hand instinctively reaching for a sidearm that was no longer there. She glanced at him, those green eyes unreadable. Maybe I needed someone broken enough to understand. Before he could ask what she meant, she was walking back to the wagon. Marcus followed, noting how she moved through the wilderness like she was part of it. Every step was deliberate, every glance calculated. This wasn't a woman who made careless decisions. The trail grew steeper as they climbed higher into the mountains. Marcus found himself studying the landscape, his military training automatically cataloguing defensible positions and potential ambush points. Old habits died hard, even when the war was long over. "You expecting trouble?" Elara asked, as if reading his thoughts. "Always." The answer came without thinking. "Learned that lesson the hard way." She nodded, and for a moment, something like understanding passed between them. These mountains have their own kind of trouble, different from what you knew in the war, but just as deadly. As if summoned by her words, the crack of a rifle split the mountain air. The bullet splintered the wooden seat inches from Elara's hand. She was moving before the echo faded, diving for her rifle, while Marcus rolled off the wagon despite the fire that shot through his leg. "Stay down," she hissed. But Marcus was already scanning the tree line. There, a flash of movement behind a cluster of boulders about 50 yards up the slope. "Two of them," he whispered. "Maybe three. They've got the high ground." Another shot rang out, this one punching through the wagon's canvas cover. The horses whinnied in terror, straining against their traces. Elara's rifle answered with a sharp crack, and Marcus heard a yelp of pain from the rocks above. "Can you shoot?" she asked. Marcus tested his grip on the pistol at his hip. His hands were steady enough. "Well enough. There's a rifle in the wagon bed. Cover me while I get to those trees." She was planning to flank them. It was a good strategy, but dangerous with his limited mobility. "Elara, just do it." She was already moving, using the wagon as cover, while Marcus hauled himself up to grab the rifle. It was a Winchester, well-maintained and recently cleaned. When she broke from cover, sprinting toward a stand of pines, he laid down, covering fire, sending 3 quick shots toward the boulder cluster. The return fire was immediate and intense. Marcus counted at least 4 different positions now. This wasn't a random robbery. It was a coordinated ambush. From the pines, Elara's rifle spoke again, and one of the muzzle flashes went silent. The remaining attackers shifted their focus toward her position, giving Marcus the opening he needed. Despite the agony in his leg, he limped toward a rocky outcrop that would give him a better angle. The firefight lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the last shot faded into mountain silence, 3 men lay dead among the rocks, and Marcus found himself bleeding from a graze across his shoulder. Elara emerged from the trees, checking each body with professional thoroughness. "You hit?" she called. "Nothing serious." Marcus examined the dead men. They were rough-looking, the kind who haunted mining camps and frontier towns, but their weapons were too good, their positioning too smart for common road agents. This wasn't random. "No," Elara agreed, her voice tight. It wasn't. She was studying something in one of the dead men's hands, a piece of paper. When Marcus limped over to look, she quickly folded it and tucked it into her jacket. What was that? Nothing important, but her eyes said otherwise. "We need to move. There might be more." As they got the wagon ready to continue, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just been drawn into something much larger than a simple employment arrangement. The way Elara had fought, the coordination of the attack, that paper she'd hidden, none of it felt like coincidence. The passage opened into a hidden valley, maybe 50 yards across, ringed by towering walls of granite. At its heart sat a cabin that made his breath catch. This wasn't the rough-hewn structure he'd expected, but something altogether different. The logs were massive, perfectly fitted, and weathered to a silver grey that spoke of decades, maybe longer. Smoke curled from a stone chimney that looked older than anything he'd seen this side of the Mississippi. "Welcome home," Elena said, and something in her voice made him look at her sharply. As they approached the cabin, Cade noticed details that set his nerves on edge. The windows were positioned for maximum visibility of the valley's single entrance. Gun ports had been cleverly disguised as decorative elements in the chinking between logs. This wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. Inside, the cabin's secrets deepened. The main room was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a ceiling that soared into shadow. Hand-carved furniture spoke of craftsmanship from another era, and the stone fireplace could have heated a mansion. But it was the maps that caught his attention. They covered one entire wall, dozens of them, some hand-drawn, others printed, all focused on the surrounding mountain range. Red pins marked various locations, connected by lengths of colored string that formed a complex web. Numbers and dates were penciled in margins, written in what looked like multiple hands. "Expecting company?" Cade asked, nodding toward a rifle rack that held enough firepower to outfit a small army. Elena followed his gaze. In these mountains, it pays to be prepared. She moved to the kitchen area, filling a coffee pot from a hand pump that suggested a well beneath the floor. Everything about this place spoke of permanence, of someone who'd built not just for comfort but for survival. "Your grandfather built this place?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Elena's hands stilled on the pump handle. "Among others," she finally said. Cade studied her profile, noting the tension in her shoulders. "Others?" "This valley has a long history, Cade, longer than most folks would believe. What exactly am I here to help you find?" Elena turned, and for a moment her carefully controlled mask slipped. He saw something raw in her expression, fear maybe, or determination so fierce it bordered on desperation. "My grandfather spent 40 years searching these mountains," she said, "following stories, chasing legends. Most people thought he was crazy. And you? I thought so too, until I found his journal." She disappeared into what he assumed was a bedroom, returning with a leather-bound book that had seen hard use. The cover was scarred and stained, held together with strips of rawhide. "3 weeks ago, I finally understood what he was really looking for." She opened the journal, revealing pages covered in tight handwriting, sketches, and what looked like coded notations, and I realized I wasn't the only one. Someone else is searching? Someone else found his journal first, or part of it anyway. Elena's jaw tightened. "They've been asking questions in the settlements, offering money for information about abandoned cabins, old claims, anything connected to my family. Enough to make people forget their manners, enough to make them dangerous." The implications hit him like a cold wind. He was trapped in a hidden valley with a woman he barely knew, chasing something valuable enough that others were willing to kill for it. His hand instinctively moved toward where his sidearm would have hung, finding only empty air. Elena noticed the gesture. Without a word, she walked to a cabinet and withdrew a gun belt, complete with a well-maintained Colt revolver. "I told you I'd pay for the best," she said, offering him the weapon. "That includes making sure you're properly equipped." The ride up the mountain took 3 hours, winding through pine forests that grew thicker with each mile. Sarah had given him a horse, a sturdy bay gelding that seemed to know these trails better than any map. She rode ahead on a paint mare, her rifle across her saddle, eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Marcus hadn't expected the silence to be comfortable, but it was. After months of forced conversation with well-meaning townspeople who didn't know what to say to a broken soldier, the quiet felt like medicine. His leg ached something fierce, but the movement helped work out the stiffness that plagued him in town. She was right. Marcus could smell the change in the air, feel the pressure dropping. In the war, he'd learned to read weather like a battlefield. It could mean the difference between life and death. They crested a ridge, and Sarah's cabin came into view. It wasn't what he'd expected. The structure was solid, well-maintained, with a wide porch and stone chimney already sending up a thin ribbon of smoke. Outbuildings dotted the clearing, a barn, what looked like a workshop, and something covered by a tarp that he couldn't identify. "You've been busy up here," he said as they dismounted. "Had to be." She unsaddled her mare with efficient movements. "Winter's long when you're alone." But as Marcus looked around, he realized she hadn't been entirely alone. Fresh horse tracks led away from the barn, too recent to be hers from the morning. Boot prints in the mud near the workshop belonged to feet bigger than Sarah's. Someone else had been here, and recently. Sarah noticed him studying the ground. "You see it too. How long since you've had visitors?" "Officially? 3 months." She pulled her rifle from its scabbard and checked the load. "Unofficially? Someone's been sniffing around for weeks, always when I'm away." Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. Sarah motioned toward the cabin. "Inside. We'll tend the horses after we talk." The interior was sparse but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by bookshelves that surprised him, leather-bound volumes on everything from medicine to mining. A table sat near the window, covered with maps and what looked like surveying equipment. "Coffee?" Sarah asked, already moving toward the stove. "Please." Marcus settled into a chair, grateful to rest his leg. "You going to tell me what this is really about? Because that auction story doesn't explain the maps or why someone's tracking your movements." Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee, her movements deliberate. When she turned back, her expression had hardened into something Marcus recognized, the look of someone about to share intelligence that could get people killed. "My husband didn't just disappear, Marcus. He was murdered." "How do you know?" "Because of what he found." She spread one of the maps on the table, pointing to an area marked with red ink. "There's a mine up here, abandoned for 20 years. Or supposed to be. James discovered someone's been working it in secret, pulling out ore worth more than this whole territory." Marcus studied the map, noting the careful notations in James's handwriting, elevation markers, water sources, and what looked like guard positions. He was surveying it. "More than that. He found out who's behind it." Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "It's not some random claim jumpers, Marcus. It's connected to people in high places. People who can make problems disappear, like husbands who ask too many questions, and soldiers who might help their widows find answers." The implications hit him like a physical blow. She hadn't bought him to work her land or provide protection in any conventional sense. She'd acquired herself a partner who understood tactics, who knew how to move unseen and fight when cornered. "The men who've been watching your place," he said. "They're not just keeping tabs. They're waiting for something. For me to find James's evidence and try to act on it." Sarah folded the map carefully. "Or for someone like you to show up and give them an excuse to finish what they started." Lightning illuminated the cabin in stark relief, followed immediately by thunder that shook the windows. The storm was directly overhead now, but Marcus suspected the real tempest was just beginning. "Show me everything," he said. Sarah nodded and moved to a loose floorboard near the fireplace. When she pried it up, Marcus caught a glimpse of papers, photographs, and what looked like ore samples wrapped in cloth. "James hid this the night before he disappeared," she said, pulling out a leather portfolio. "I think he knew they were coming for him." As she untied the strings binding the portfolio, Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze, the distant sound of horses moving through the storm toward the cabin. The morning air bit sharp against Caleb's face as he worked the axe, splitting logs with methodical precision. Each swing sent vibrations up his injured arm, but the rhythm helped quiet the restless thoughts that had plagued him since dawn. 5 days had passed since the encounter with the riders, and May hadn't spoken of it again, though he'd caught her studying the tree line more often than usual. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him pause mid-swing. A lone rider emerged from the pines, hands visible and empty, a gesture May had likely taught every soul who knew how to find this place. The man was older, weathered like driftwood, with silver threading through his dark beard. She had, briefly. Frank ran supplies between the scattered homesteads and mining claims, one of the few people May trusted enough to trade with regularly. Caleb set down the axe, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool air. "She's inside. Coffee's hot if you're staying." Frank's keen eyes assessed him with the same thoroughness May had shown at the auction. "Heard you had some uninvited guests recently. Word travels fast out here, faster than most folks realize." Frank tied his horse to the post, movements efficient and practiced. "That's why I'm here." They found May at the kitchen table, cleaning her rifle with the same meticulous care she applied to everything else. She looked up as they entered, and Caleb noticed the slight tension in her shoulders ease when she saw Frank. "Trouble?" she asked without preamble. Frank accepted the coffee Caleb poured, warming his hands around the cup, the kind that's been brewing for a while. Those men who came calling, they weren't just passing through. May set down the rifle, giving Frank her full attention. Caleb remained standing, sensing undercurrents in the conversation he didn't fully understand. "They're working for Marcus Thornfield," Frank continued. "Ring any bells?" The change in May was subtle but unmistakable. Her jaw tightened, and her fingers drummed once against the table before stilling completely. "I thought he was dead," she said quietly. "So did most folks. Turns out reports of his demise were greatly exaggerated." Frank sipped his coffee, watching May over the rim. "He's been buying up land rights, mining claims, anything he can get his hands on. Quiet-like through intermediaries." "What's he want with this section?" Caleb asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. Frank's gaze shifted between them. "That depends on what you've found up at the old Hartwell place." May's stillness was complete now, the kind of predatory quiet that preceded either flight or violence. "We haven't been to the Hartwell cabin." "Maybe not inside," Frank said gently. "But you've been watching it, and Thornfield's men have been asking questions about it specifically, about whether anyone's been poking around, whether May's been seen in that area." "How would he even know?" Caleb began. "Because," May interrupted, her voice steady despite the storm Caleb could see building behind her eyes. "Marcus Thornfield was my husband." The words hit the cabin like a physical force. Frank nodded grimly, while Caleb felt the ground shift beneath his understanding of everything that had brought him here. "He's been looking for you for 3 years, Frank said. "Ever since you disappeared with something that belonged to him," May finished. Or so he claimed. She stood abruptly, moving to the window that faced toward the mountains. Caleb could see her reflection in the glass, the careful mask she wore when dealing with the outside world firmly in place. "What did you take?" Caleb asked. "Evidence. Of what he did to the Hartwell family, to others." Her reflection met his eyes in the glass. "Marcus has a talent for making people disappear when they inconvenience him. The Hartwells inconvenienced him by refusing to sell their land." "The mining rights," Frank added. "That whole section sits on top of what might be the richest silver vein in the territory. The Hartwells knew it, Thornfield knew it, and when they wouldn't sell, they had an accident," May said bitterly. "A tragic fire that claimed the whole family. Very convenient for Marcus, who swooped in to buy the land from the territorial government for a fraction of its worth." Caleb felt pieces clicking into place. May's watchfulness, her knowledge of these mountains, the careful way she'd built her life in isolation. "But you had proof," he said. May turned from the window, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked vulnerable. "I had documents, correspondence, evidence that Marcus orchestrated their deaths." Her smile was sharp as a blade, hidden where only I could find it. Frank set down his empty cup. "And now he's coming to collect." The morning air bit sharp against Elias's face as he followed Maya deeper into the pines, their boots crunching through frost-brittle undergrowth. She moved like smoke between the trees, barely disturbing the branches while he crashed behind her like a drunk bear. His leg throbbed with each step, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward. "There," Maya whispered, pointing through a gap in the evergreens. Below them lay a cabin that seemed to have grown from the mountain itself. Moss carpeted its roof, and wild roses had claimed the porch railings, but the structure stood solid despite decades of abandonment. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin grey ribbon. "Someone's home," Elias muttered, checking his rifle. Maya's jaw tightened. Someone who shouldn't be. They watched from the tree line as a figure emerged from the cabin, a tall man in a worn duster, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He moved with purpose, loading saddlebags onto a paint horse tethered near the door. Even from this distance, Elias could see the man favored his left side, moving with the careful deliberation of someone nursing old wounds. "You know him?" Elias asked. Maya's silence stretched long enough that he turned to study her profile. Her knuckles were white where they gripped her rifle, and something flickered in her eyes: fear, anger, recognition. Maybe all three. "His name is Garrett Wolfe," she said finally. "He worked for my father." "Worked how?" "The kind of work that gets men killed in their sleep." Her voice carried the bitter weight of old betrayals. "He disappeared the night my father died. Took something that didn't belong to him." The pieces clicked together in Elias's mind. The map, among other things. Maya shifted, preparing to move. "He's getting ready to leave. We need to—" A rifle crack split the morning air. Bark exploded from the pine beside Maya's head, and Elias threw himself forward, tackling her to the ground as another shot whistled overhead. They rolled behind a fallen log, dirt and pine needles showering down around them. "Son of a bitch spotted us," Elias growled, levering around into his rifle's chamber. Maya was already moving, scrambling along the log's length to get a better angle. "There's another one, left side of the cabin." Elias followed her gaze and caught the glint of metal from behind a woodpile. 2 shooters, maybe more. His military instincts kicked in, cataloging distances, cover, escape routes. The cabin sat in a natural bowl surrounded by steep slopes, defensible but also a trap if you needed to run. "How well do you know this area?" he asked. "Like my own heartbeat. Is there another way down?" Maya pointed toward a rocky outcrop to their right. "Game trail. Steep, but it'll put us behind the cabin." Another shot spanged off the log, sending splinters flying. Whoever these men were, they had good rifles and knew how to use them. Elias counted the seconds between shots, listening for the rhythm of reloading. "On my signal," he whispered. "I'll keep them busy while you make for that trail. Like hell." Maya's eyes flashed. "We go together or not at all. This isn't a democracy. And you're not my commanding officer." She shifted, bringing her rifle to bear. "I've been hunting these mountains since before you could shave. Trust me to know my business." The steel in her voice reminded him why she'd bought him at that auction. Not for his protection, but for his partnership. He nodded grudgingly. They moved like dancers who'd rehearsed the steps, Maya laying down covering fire, while Elias bounded from tree to tree, then reversing roles as she leapfrogged past him. His legs screamed with each sprint, but adrenaline carried him forward. Behind them, angry shouts echoed off the mountainside as their attackers gave chase. The game trail proved to be little more than a deer track, carved into the steep slope, barely wide enough for single file. Maya led the way, sure-footed as a mountain goat, while Elias followed with less grace but dogged determination. Loose stones cascaded beneath their boots, threatening to start a slide that would announce their position to anyone within miles. Halfway down, Maya raised her fist, the universal signal to freeze. Below them, the cabin's back wall loomed close enough to touch. They could hear voices now, rough men's voices discussing search patterns and kill zones with the casual professionalism of experienced hunters. "Wolf's offering $100 for the woman," one said. "Dead or alive?" "What about the soldier? Just dead." "For now?" Vera settled into the chair across from him, cradling her coffee like it might ward off more than just the morning chill. "Garrett's brought in outside help. Men who don't care about the old agreements, the old ways of doing things up here. Men who see obstacles instead of neighbors." The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but Thorn found himself grateful for its bitter warmth. His leg ached something fierce this morning, the damp mountain air settling into his bones like an unwelcome visitor. What kind of old agreements? For a long moment, Vera stared into her cup as if the dark liquid might reveal secrets she wasn't ready to share. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of years. My grandmother made a deal with the mining company 40 years ago. They could work the lower valleys, but the high country stayed untouched. Sacred ground, she called it. The company honored that agreement until Garrett took over. And now? Now he thinks a dead woman's promises don't bind him. Vera's jaw tightened. He's wrong. Thorn studied her face, noting the fierce determination that transformed her features from merely pretty to something approaching magnificent. There's more to this than mining rights, isn't there? She stood abruptly, moving to the window where pale sunlight filtered through glass thick with age and weather. My grandmother didn't just make agreements, Thorn. She kept records. Documents that prove the original land grants, the mineral rights, all of it. Papers that would cost Garrett's company millions if they ever saw the inside of a courtroom. And these papers are hidden. She turned back to him, and her smile held no warmth. Somewhere Garrett's been trying to find for 3 years. The pieces began falling into place like dominoes in Thorn's mind. That's why he wants you gone, not just for the land, but for what you know. What I might know, Vera corrected. My grandmother was careful about what she shared, even with family. A sound from outside made them both freeze. The soft nickering of horses, the creak of leather, the deliberate quiet of men trying not to be heard. Thorn set down his coffee and reached for the rifle Vera had given him, his movements automatic despite the protest from his damaged leg. "Back door," he whispered. Vera shook her head, already moving toward a section of wall that looked no different from any other. Her fingers found some hidden catch, and a panel swung inward, revealing a narrow passage that disappeared into darkness. "Grandmother's insurance policy," she murmured, grabbing a pack that had been sitting ready by the door. "Connects to the old mine workings. We can—" The front door exploded inward with a crash that seemed to shake the entire cabin. 3 men poured through the opening, guns drawn, faces hard with purpose. Thorn recognized the type, hired muscle, probably brought up from Denver or Colorado Springs, men who killed for money and slept just fine afterward. "Well, well," the lead man said, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. "Miss Morrison, you've been a hard woman to pin down." Vera's hand hadn't moved toward her weapon, but Thorn could feel the coiled tension radiating from her like heat from a forge. "I wasn't aware I was lost, Mr. Hayes." So she knew them. That was either very good or very bad, and Thorn had a sinking feeling it was the latter. Hayes smiled, the expression predatory. "Mr. Garrett's patience has run thin. He's prepared to make you a final offer for your cooperation. And if I decline?" The smile widened. "Well now, that would be unfortunate for everyone involved." Thorn shifted slightly, calculating distances, angles, the likelihood of reaching cover before the shooting started. His leg throbbed with each heartbeat, but his hands remained steady on the rifle. The mountain morning suddenly felt much colder. "Your father," he said slowly, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "The one who supposedly died in a mining accident." Thomas Whitmore. The name fell from her lips like a stone dropping into still water. He didn't die in any accident. He was murdered because he found something up here that certain people didn't want found. Sarah nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "For 3 years I've been gathering information, tracking down leads, following paper trails that led nowhere. The auction was Providence. I needed someone with military experience, someone who understood how to fight, how to survive, someone desperate enough to ask no questions, and someone expendable." The words came out harsher than he intended, but Sarah didn't flinch. "I thought so at first." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for that, Jake. Truly. But you have to understand, my father was everything to me. When he died, they took my home, my inheritance, everything. Said he died owing debts that never existed. Jake stood and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness that seemed to press against the glass like a living thing. Who's they? The Hartwell Mining Consortium. They've been buying up claims all through these mountains, sometimes legally, sometimes not. My father discovered they were falsifying geological surveys, claiming worthless land while secretly mining the valuable deposits on property that wasn't theirs. And the evidence? Sarah reached into her pack and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and worn. This was hidden in the last cabin we searched. My father's field notes. He documented everything, the real mineral content of various claims, the consortium's illegal operations, names, dates, locations. Jake took the journal, feeling its weight like he was holding dynamite. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, detailed sketches of mining operations, and what looked like maps of underground tunnels. This is enough to destroy them. It's enough to get us killed. Sarah's voice was steady, but Jake caught the tremor in her hands as she reached for the journal. The consortium has people everywhere. Law enforcement, territorial government, even some of the federal marshals. My father tried to go through official channels. 2 weeks later, he was found at the bottom of a mine shaft with a broken neck. The pieces clicked into place with uncomfortable clarity. The men tracking us. Consortium enforcers. They must have gotten word that someone was nosing around the abandoned claims again. Sarah moved to stand beside him at the window. I should have told you from the beginning. You deserve to know what you were walking into. Jake studied her profile in the darkness, noting the determined set of her jaw, the way her shoulders squared despite the weight of secrets she'd carried alone. Would it have changed anything? If you'd told me at the auction, would you have come? He considered this, thinking of the desperate circumstances that had led him to that platform, the hollow emptiness that had consumed him since the war. Probably. A man with nothing to lose makes for poor decision-making. And now? Now that you know what we're up against? Jake looked down at the journal in his hands, then back at Sarah. In the firelight, she looked younger, more vulnerable than the confident woman who'd bid on him with such certainty. But there was steel beneath that vulnerability, a core of determination that reminded him of soldiers he'd known who fought not for glory but for something deeper, more personal. Now I know why you picked someone expendable, he said, surprising himself with a slight smile. Question is, what do we do with this information? Running won't solve anything. They'll just hunt down the next person who gets too close to the truth. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to think past simple survival. There's a federal judge in Denver, Jonathan Crawford. My father mentioned him in his notes. Apparently one of the few officials the consortium hasn't bought or intimidated. If we could get this evidence to him, that's a long ride through dangerous country. Yes, with killers on our trail and winter coming on hard. Yes. Jake closed the journal and met her gaze. Then we'd better get started. The morning air bit sharp against Caleb's face as he followed Raven deeper into the pine-shadowed canyon. 3 days had passed since they'd found the surveyor's marks, and she'd grown increasingly restless, pacing the cabin at dawn like a caged wolf. Now she moved with deliberate purpose, her rifle slung across her back and her eyes scanning every shadow. There, she whispered, pointing toward a cluster of boulders where the morning light revealed fresh horse tracks in the mud. They've been watching us. Caleb knelt beside the prints, his fingers tracing the distinctive notch in one horseshoe. Same ones from yesterday, 2 riders, maybe 3. His leg protested as he straightened, but he ignored the familiar ache. Question is, are they just watching, or are they waiting for something? Raven's jaw tightened. In my experience, men who lurk in shadows rarely have good intentions. She turned toward the higher ground, where the trees thinned and granite peaks thrust skyward. Come on, there's something else I need to show you. They climbed for an hour, the air growing thinner and colder with each step. Caleb's breathing came harder now, his wounded body struggling with the altitude, but he pressed on. Whatever secrets these mountains held, they were worth the price Raven was paying to protect them. The cave mouth appeared suddenly, hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss and twisted roots. Raven pushed through first, disappearing into the darkness. Caleb hesitated only a moment before following, his hand instinctively moving to his pistol. "Oh my God," he breathed. "How long has this been here?" "Years." Raven moved to one of the crates, her fingers trailing over the weathered wood. "My father started collecting evidence after the first families disappeared. Every surveyor's report, every mining claim, every deed that suddenly changed hands." She lifted a thick folder from the table. "It's all here, Caleb, the whole conspiracy." He opened the folder with trembling hands. The papers inside told a story of systematic theft, false claims, forged documents, and families driven from their land by men who knew exactly what lay beneath the surface. Names he didn't recognize appeared again and again, along with one that made his blood run cold. "Henderson Mining Company," he read aloud. "That's the outfit that's been buying up claims in 3 counties. "Not buying," Raven corrected. "Stealing. They find isolated families, make problems for them. Accidents, false accusations, mysterious fires. When people get desperate enough, they sell for whatever they can get." Her voice turned bitter. "Or they disappear entirely." Caleb set the folder down carefully. "And your father figured this out?" "He figured out enough to get himself killed for it." She moved to another crate, this one smaller than the rest. But before they got him, he made sure someone would know the truth. The smaller crate contained something that made Caleb's pulse quicken. Sticks of dynamite, carefully wrapped and stored, enough to bring down a mountain or seal a mine shaft permanently. "Jesus, Raven, what exactly are you planning?" Before she could answer, the sound of voices echoed from outside the cave. Both of them froze, hands moving to their weapons. The voices grew closer, accompanied by the scrape of boots on stone. "Tracks lead right up here," a man was saying. "They've got to be close." "Spread out," came another voice, this one with an authority that suggested leadership. "Check every crevice. The woman's got something we need, and I'm tired of playing games." Raven's eyes met Caleb's in the dim light. Without words, they moved to opposite sides of the cave mouth, weapons drawn. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands were steady. The war had taught him many things, but perhaps the most valuable was how to kill quietly when necessary. The first man appeared at the cave entrance, like a shadow given form. Caleb's knife found his throat before he could make a sound. The body dropped silently to the moss-covered ground. "Charlie?" The second voice came from somewhere to their left. "You find it?" Raven had already melted into the forest, moving with the predatory grace that had first caught Caleb's attention. He heard a brief struggle, a muffled grunt, then silence. When she returned, her knife was clean, but her eyes were hard as winter stone. "There's a third one," she whispered. "He's heading back down the mountain." Caleb nodded grimly. Their sanctuary was compromised now. Whatever came next, they would face it together, with nothing but the truth at their backs and the promise of violence ahead. The hunt had begun in earnest. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clearing as Maya knelt beside the hidden cache they'd discovered beneath the cabin's floorboards. Her fingers traced the edges of weathered documents, each one potentially worth more than the entire settlement below. Jake stood guard at the window, his rifle ready, though his injured shoulder still protested with every movement. "These survey maps go back 40 years, Maya whispered, spreading the papers across the rough wooden floor. "Look at these markings. Someone's been tracking mineral deposits throughout the entire mountain range." Jake glanced over, noting the careful annotations in faded ink. "That's not just copper or iron. These symbols—" He moved closer, his military training helping him decipher the coded notations. "Maya, I think this is silver, maybe even gold." The implications hit them both simultaneously. The mysterious deaths, the abandoned cabins, the way certain folks in town seemed nervous whenever strangers asked too many questions. It all pointed to something far more valuable than anyone had let on. A twig snapped outside. Maya's hand instinctively moved to her knife while Jake positioned himself at the window's edge. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their faces hard and purposeful. She recognized one of them immediately, Garrett Sullivan, the man who'd been asking questions about her at Murphy's store. "We need to go," Jake murmured, already gathering the most important documents. "Now." But Maya hesitated, her eyes fixed on something else in the cache. A small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. She grabbed it just as the sound of approaching horses grew louder. They slipped out the cabin's back door, moving as quietly as shadows through the dense undergrowth. Maya led the way along a deer trail she'd used countless times, her knowledge of these mountains their only advantage. Behind them, she could hear the men dismounting, their voices carrying on the morning air. "Check everything," Sullivan's voice commanded. "Tear the place apart if you have to." Jake's breathing was labored, his shoulder wound from their earlier encounter clearly taking its toll. Maya caught his arm as he stumbled, feeling the tremor that ran through him. The auction had branded him as broken goods, but she'd seen his strength, his determination. Now she witnessed his vulnerability too, and it stirred something protective in her chest. They reached a rocky outcropping where Maya had cached supplies years ago. Hidden beneath a carefully arranged pile of stones was a small cave, barely large enough for 2 people. She pulled Jake inside just as the sound of pursuit grew closer. In the dim light filtering through the cave opening, Maya finally opened the leather journal. The first page bore a name that made her blood run cold, Thomas Hartwell, her father's name. "What is it?" Jake whispered, noting her sudden stillness. She couldn't speak for a moment, couldn't process what she was seeing. Page after page of her father's handwriting, documenting meetings with mining company representatives, payments received for keeping certain information quiet, and detailed maps of the richest mineral deposits in the region. "My father," she finally managed. "He was involved in this. He knew about the silver deposits and was taking money to keep them secret." Jake studied her face in the pale light. "That explains why someone might have wanted him dead." The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Her father hadn't died in a simple accident. Someone had discovered his double-dealing, his attempts to play both sides of whatever game was being played in these mountains. Outside their hiding place, they could hear the search party moving through the forest, their voices growing more frustrated as the trail went cold. Maya pressed herself against the cave wall, the journal clutched to her chest. Everything she thought she knew about her father, about her life in these mountains, was crumbling. Jake reached for her hand in the darkness, his fingers warm and steady against hers. "Whatever he did, it doesn't define who you are." His words cut through her spiral of doubt and anger. She'd spent years living alone in these mountains, convinced that isolation was strength. But having someone see her pain and offer comfort without judgment, it was both terrifying and necessary. "They killed him for this information," she said quietly. "And now they'll kill us too. Not if we're smarter than they are." Jake's voice carried a determination that reminded her why she'd bid on him at that auction. Beneath the scars and the reputation for being damaged goods was a man who knew how to fight, how to survive. The voices outside began to fade as the search party moved further away. Maya knew they had maybe an hour before Sullivan and his men widened their search pattern, an hour to decide whether to run or make a stand. She looked at Jake in the filtered cave light, seeing something in his eyes that matched what she felt building in her own chest. They'd uncovered secrets worth killing for, but they'd also found something else, a partnership that neither of them had expected. The mountain woman and the broken soldier. Maybe together, they were stronger than the sum of their damaged parts. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like smoke from a dying fire as Caleb watched 3 riders emerge from the tree line below. His chest tightened with recognition. Marshal Hayes rode in the center, flanked by 2 men whose brass badges caught the early sunlight. Federal marshals by the look of their bearing and the quality of their horses. "Zara," he called softly, not taking his eyes from the approaching riders. "We've got company." She appeared beside him at the cabin window, her face hardening as she studied the men below. They're heading straight for us. No hesitation, no searching. Her voice carried a bitter edge. Someone told them exactly where to find us. Caleb's hand instinctively moved to his sidearm, muscle memory from years of soldiering taking over, despite the tremor in his fingers. How long do we have? 10 minutes, maybe less. Zara was already moving, gathering the maps and documents they'd found in her father's hidden cache. There's a back trail through the rocks, but it's treacherous. Your leg? Zara paused, her hands full of papers that could expose the corruption reaching from the local mining consortium all the way to territorial officials. Her father had died protecting these secrets, and now they faced the same choice: run and preserve the truth, or stand and likely lose everything. We take what we can carry. She stuffed the most damaging documents into a leather satchel. The rest we hide. They worked in silent efficiency, born of their weeks together facing one crisis after another. Caleb secured their weapons and supplies, while Zara concealed the remaining papers in a hollow beneath the floorboards. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. "Zara Blackwood!" Marshal Hayes's voice boomed across the clearing. "Come out peaceful, and we'll talk." She met Caleb's eyes, and he saw the decision forming there. "Go," she whispered. "Take the back trail. Get those papers to someone who can use them." "Not without you." The words surprised him with their vehemence. Somewhere between that first day at the auction and this moment, she'd become more than just the woman who'd bought his freedom. She'd become his anchor, his purpose, his... "This isn't your fight, Caleb." "Like hell it isn't." He stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. "Your father died for this truth. I won't let his sacrifice mean nothing, but I won't let you face it alone either." The sound of boots on the cabin's front porch ended their debate. Zara grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the back room where a narrow window opened onto the rocky slope behind the cabin. "We know you're in there," Hayes called. "The warrant's been signed. You're wanted for the murder of Deputy Morrison." Zara's sharp intake of breath told Caleb everything. Morrison, the deputy who'd been asking too many questions about the mining claims. They'd found his body 3 days ago, but Zara had been with Caleb the entire time. Someone was tying up loose ends and pinning the blame on her. The window stuck, swollen from years of mountain weather. Caleb threw his shoulder against the frame, ignoring the spike of pain through his injured leg. On the third try, it gave way with a protesting screech of wood. "Move! Move!" He boosted Zara through first, then followed as the front door exploded inward. They hit the rocky slope running, loose shale sliding beneath their boots. Caleb's legs screamed in protest, but adrenaline carried him forward. Shouts erupted behind them, followed by the sharp crack of rifle fire. The back trail Zara had mentioned proved to be little more than a deer path winding between granite outcroppings. Perfect cover, but treacherous footing. They climbed hard, using every boulder and crevice to shield themselves from the pursuing marshals. "There!" Zara pointed to a narrow gap between two towering rock faces. "Through there, and we can reach the old mining road." More gunshots echoed from below, closer now. Hayes had split his men, trying to flank them. Caleb could hear boots scrambling over stone, the harsh breathing of men pushing hard in the thin mountain air. They squeezed through the gap, emerging onto a wider ledge that offered a moment's respite. The valley spread below them, morning sun burning off the mist to reveal the full scope of the mining operations that had started this whole deadly game. "Look at it," Zara breathed, her voice mixing anger and sorrow. All that destruction, all those lives lost, just so a few men could get rich. Caleb followed her gaze, seeing not just the scarred landscape, but the bigger picture. The corruption, the murdered officials, the systematic theft of land and resources. His war might be over, but this fight was just beginning. "Then we make sure they pay," he said, shouldering the satchel of evidence. "All of them." The morning brought Clara's fever down enough that she could sit upright without the world spinning, though Ezra insisted she remain in bed. He'd spent the night in the chair beside her, his rifle across his knees, watching the windows with eyes that never seemed to close. Dark circles shadowed his face, but his alertness remained sharp as a blade. "You look worse than I feel," Clara murmured, reaching for the water cup on the nightstand. "Doubt that." Ezra's voice carried the rasp of exhaustion. "How's the shoulder?" She tested the movement carefully. The burning had dulled to a persistent ache, and the angry red streaks that had crawled down her arm like poison ivy had faded to pink. Better, much better. Through the cabin's front window, she could see movement in the tree line. Not the natural sway of branches, but deliberate, calculated positioning. Men who thought they were hidden but cast shadows that didn't belong to the forest. "How many?" she asked. "6 that I can count, maybe more." Ezra stood, stretching muscles that had been locked in position too long. "They're not rushing in, which means they want us alive. For now." Clara pushed herself to sitting, ignoring the protest from her shoulder. "The map pieces. They know we have them." More than that. Ezra moved to the window, keeping to the side where he couldn't be seen. "I've been thinking about what Thomas said, about people looking for this place for decades. What if we're not the first to find it?" The implications settled between them like cold water. Clara's mind raced through the possibilities. "You think others have been here before us?" and disappeared. Ezra's jaw tightened. "Question is, what's down in that mine that's worth killing for, worth dying for?" A branch snapped outside, closer than before. Through the window, Clara caught a glimpse of a man's hat moving between the pines. They were tightening the circle. "There's something else," she said, reaching for her boots. "When I was burning up with fever, I kept thinking about my father's journal. Not the pages about the map, but the earlier entries. He wrote about a conversation he overheard in Denver, about a mining operation that went dark overnight. The whole crew just vanished." Ezra turned from the window. "When?" 1862. Right around the time this area was being surveyed. Clara laced her boots with careful movements. What if the mine down there isn't abandoned? What if it was sealed, deliberately? The sound of boots on gravel reached them from multiple directions now. No longer trying to hide their approach, the men outside were positioning for a coordinated assault. Through the back window, Clara could see the glint of rifle barrels in the morning sun. "We need to go," Ezra said, checking his ammunition. "Now." Clara grabbed her father's journal and the precious map fragments, stuffing them into her coat pocket. The fever had weakened her, but adrenaline was a powerful remedy. She could feel strength returning to her limbs, sharpened by the clarity that came with mortal danger. "The mine," she said. "If they want us alive, they won't follow us down there. Not if they know what happened to the others." Ezra nodded grimly. "Unless they know something we don't." A voice called out from the trees, rough and commanding. "You in the cabin. Come out with your hands visible and nobody gets hurt." "Big of them," Ezra muttered, slinging his rifle across his back. He moved to the cabin's rear door, testing the handle quietly. "On my signal, we run for the mine entrance. Don't look back. Don't stop for anything." Clara checked her revolver, grateful that her father had insisted she learn to shoot with both hands. The left would have to do today. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." But something in his voice made her look at him sharply. There was a finality there, a resignation that chilled her more than the mountain air. "Ezra." "Clara." He turned to face her fully, and in his eyes she saw something that stopped her breath. Not just determination, but something deeper, something that looked like goodbye. "Whatever happens, you get to that mine. You find out what this is all about. Promise me." Before she could respond, gunfire erupted from the front of the cabin. Wood splintered as bullets punched through the walls, sending dust and debris cascading from the ceiling. The coordinated assault had begun. "Now!" Ezra yanked open the back door. Clara burst through first, her legs carrying her across the open ground toward the dark mouth of the mine. Behind her, she heard Ezra's rifle crack once, twice, then his boots pounding the earth as he followed. Shouts erupted from the trees as their escape was discovered. More gunfire, closer now. A bullet whined past her ear like an angry wasp. The mine entrance loomed ahead, a black wound in the mountainside that promised either salvation or a different kind of death entirely. The morning light filtering through the cabin windows revealed the aftermath of their discovery. Maps and documents covered every surface, creating a maze of evidence that painted a picture neither of them had fully grasped until now. Elena stood at the window, her silhouette tense against the dawn sky, while Marcus sat hunched over the largest map, tracing property lines with his finger. "It's not just about the gold," Elena said quietly, her breath fogging the glass. "It never was." Marcus looked up from the surveyor's notes he'd been studying. The precise measurements and legal descriptions told a story of systematic theft spanning decades. "Your father wasn't just mining, he was documenting everything. Every claim jumped, every family forced out, every acre stolen." She turned from the window, her green eyes reflecting a mixture of grief and determination. "He died for this, for trying to prove what Garrett and his associates were doing." Her voice caught slightly. "All those years I thought he'd abandoned us, and he was actually trying to protect us." "They know we're here," Marcus said, already moving toward the back of the cabin. "We need to get this evidence out." Elena began gathering the most crucial documents, while Marcus checked his ammunition. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd been sold like property was now fighting to expose others who'd built their empire on stolen land. His hands were steady as he loaded his rifle, muscle memory from the war taking over. "There's a root cellar," Elena said, pulling up a hidden trapdoor near the fireplace. "Some of these documents need to survive even if we don't." The horses were closer now, their hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. Marcus helped Elena lower a waterproof pouch containing copies of the most damning evidence into the cellar. She replaced the boards and scattered debris over them just as Garrett's voice boomed across the clearing. "Elena Reyes, I know you're in there. Come out and we can discuss this like civilized people." Marcus positioned himself at the front window while Elena took the side. The 4 men had spread out, surrounding the cabin with practiced efficiency. These weren't just hired guns, they moved like men with military training. "What's there to discuss, Garrett?" Elena called back. "How you murdered my father, how you've been stealing land for 20 years. Garrett's laugh was cold. "Your father was a drunk and a dreamer. He got in over his head with dangerous people. People like you," Marcus said, loud enough to carry. He could see Garrett's face tighten at the sound of his voice. "Ah, the auction boy speaks. Tell me, soldier, was Elena worth the price she paid? Because you're both about to discover how expensive your curiosity has become." Elena's rifle cracked from the side window, keeping another gunman pinned behind a boulder. The cabin filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder as they settled into a deadly rhythm. Marcus had been in enough firefights to know they were outgunned and surrounded, but the cabin's position gave them some advantage. "The back window," Elena said during a lull in the shooting. "There's a trail down to the creek. If one of us could make it, we both make it or neither of us does." Marcus cut her off, reloading quickly. Another volley of shots peppered the cabin walls. Through the smoke and chaos, Marcus caught Elena's eye. Something had shifted between them over these past days. What had started as a business arrangement forged in desperation had become something deeper, more real than anything he'd known. "Whatever happens," she said, "thank you for believing me." Before he could respond, the sound of breaking glass came from the back of the cabin. One of Garrett's men had circled around and was climbing through the rear window. Marcus spun and fired in one fluid motion, the impact sending the intruder crashing back outside. But the distraction cost them. Garrett and his remaining men rushed the front of the cabin, their boots pounding across the wooden porch. Marcus grabbed Elena's hand, pulling her toward the trapdoor. "The cellar," he said. "It's our only chance." As they dropped through the opening, Marcus could hear Garrett's voice above them, filled with rage and triumph. "Burn it," he ordered. "Burn it all." The smell of smoke began filtering down through the floorboards as Elena and Marcus huddled in the darkness below, the evidence of decades of corruption hidden in the earth around them. The gunshot echoed through the mountain air like thunder, and Clara felt the world tilt sideways as Marcus stumbled backward, crimson blooming across his shirt. Her scream tore from her throat as she lunged forward, catching him before he could fall completely. "Well, well," Harlan's voice carried a satisfied drawl as he stepped from behind the massive pine, rifle still smoking in his hands. "Took you too long enough to find what I've been looking for." Clara's hands pressed against Marcus's wound, feeling the warm blood seep between her fingers. His breathing was labored but steady, and his eyes remained focused on her face with grim determination. "The deed," she whispered, suddenly understanding. "You killed my father for the deed." Marcus shifted slightly, his hand moving almost imperceptibly toward the pistol at his hip. Clara saw the movement and kept talking, hoping to distract Harlan long enough. "Had to be patient. Knew eventually you'd come back, especially once word got out about the survey reports." Harlan's eyes gleamed with greed. "That whole ridge is sitting on a fortune in silver ore. Mining companies been trying to buy up every claim in the valley, but your daddy's land is the key piece, controls the water rights, and the only decent access road." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Her father's mysterious reluctance to discuss certain parts of their property, his insistence on keeping the original land grants in the family safe, his growing paranoia in those final letters before his death. "He knew, didn't he?" Clara said, "about the silver. Smart man, your daddy. Had his own survey done quiet-like, but he was too honorable for his own good." Harlan stepped closer, and Clara could see the cold calculation in his eyes. Thought he could keep it all buried, preserve the land like some kind of sanctuary. Didn't understand that progress ain't something you can stop. Marcus's breathing had grown shallower, but his fingers had found the grip of his pistol. Clara felt him tense slightly, preparing to move despite his injury. "The cabin," she said quickly, buying more time. "You've been watching it. Had to make sure nobody else figured it out. When you showed up with your soldier boy here, I knew it was just a matter of time before you found what your daddy hid." Harlan gestured with the rifle toward the weathered structure. "Deed's in there somewhere, ain't it? Along with the survey reports, and probably a whole mess of other papers that mining company would pay handsomely to get their hands on. And if we refuse to tell you where—" Harlan's smile was cold as winter wind. "Won't much matter. Once you two have another unfortunate accident, I'll have all the time in the world to tear that place apart, board by board." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, but they also crystallized something hard and unforgiving in her chest. This man had stolen her father from her, had been circling like a vulture waiting to claim what wasn't his, and now threatened to take Marcus too. "There's one problem with your plan," Marcus said, his voice rough but clear. Harlan's attention shifted to him, and that moment of distraction was all Clara needed. She grabbed a handful of dirt and stones and hurled it directly at Harlan's face while simultaneously rolling to the side, pulling Marcus with her. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as Harlan stumbled backward, cursing and clawing at his eyes. Marcus, despite his wound, had his pistol out and aimed before Harlan could recover. "Drop the rifle," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who'd seen too much violence to hesitate when it mattered. Harlan froze, calculation flickering across his features as he weighed his options. For a moment, Clara thought he might comply. Then his face twisted with desperate fury, and he began to swing the rifle back toward them. Marcus's shot was clean and final. Harlan pitched backward and lay still among the fallen pine needles. The sudden silence felt deafening. Clara's ears rang as she helped Marcus sit up against a nearby tree trunk, her hands already working to examine his wound more carefully. "How bad?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "I'll live," he said, though his face was pale. Went through the shoulder, missed anything vital. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. They'd found the truth about her father's death, but the real treasure, what they'd built together, was what mattered most. The sound of boots on gravel cut through the pre-dawn stillness as Marcus crept toward the old mining office. Sarah had positioned herself behind the water trough, rifle trained on the main trail while he approached from the blind side of the weathered building. His leg ached with each careful step, but the familiar weight of his Colt steadied his nerves. Through a gap in the rotted boards, he glimpsed movement inside. Two figures hunched over what looked like maps spread across a makeshift table. Marcus recognized the broader silhouette immediately, Sheriff Coleman, the man who'd been hunting them across 3 counties. The other figure remained in shadow. "Should have burned everything when we had the chance," Coleman was saying, his voice carrying the edge of desperation. "Now half the territory knows about the silver." Marcus shifted for a better view, his boot catching a loose stone. The tiny sound might as well have been a gunshot in the stillness. Both men inside froze. "Check the perimeter," Harrison ordered. Coleman drew his weapon and moved toward the door. Marcus pressed himself against the building's side, counting heartbeats. When the sheriff emerged, Marcus was ready. His arms snaked around Coleman's throat, dragging him backward into the shadows. "Make a sound and die quiet," Marcus whispered against the man's ear. Coleman struggled briefly, then went limp. Marcus relieved him of his gun and badge before binding his wrists with leather cord. Inside the building, Harrison called out impatiently, "Problem, Sheriff?" Marcus considered his options. The judge was cunning, probably armed, and had the advantage of cover. But surprise was still on Marcus's side. He picked up a handful of gravel and tossed it toward the far side of the camp. Harrison's attention turned toward the sound, giving Marcus the opening he needed. He slipped through the doorway, Colt drawn and ready. "Hands where I can see them, Judge." Harrison turned slowly, his face a mask of cold calculation rather than surprise. "Mr. Webb, I wondered when you'd surface. Been wondering about you too, like how a territorial judge ends up claiming abandoned mining rights under false names." A thin smile played at Harrison's lips. "Sarah didn't tell you everything, did she? This land has been in dispute for decades. The original claims were fraudulent, filed by her grandfather using forged documents. I'm simply correcting a historical injustice by murdering anyone who gets in your way. Regrettable but necessary. The silver deposits here could fund territorial development for generations. A few lives weighed against the greater good." Harrison shrugged. Marcus kept his gun trained on the judge while scanning the maps on the table. Survey documents, claim papers, and what looked like geological reports covered every surface. The scope of the operation was staggering. "Sarah's father found out, didn't he? That's why you had him killed." Thomas was offered a generous partnership. He chose righteousness over pragmatism. Harrison's eyes hardened. "A mistake I won't allow his daughter to repeat." The sound of approaching horses drifted through the thin walls. Marcus tensed, but Harrison smiled. "Expecting company, Judge?" "Insurance, Mr. Webb. Did you really think I'd come here with only the good sheriff for protection?" Through the gaps in the boards, Marcus spotted at least 4 riders surrounding the camp. Sarah's position behind the water trough would be exposed within minutes. He needed to end this quickly. "Sarah!" he called out. "Riders coming in from the North Trail." Harrison lunged for a rifle propped against the wall. Marcus fired, the bullet splintering wood inches from the judge's hand. The older man dove behind an overturned desk as return fire erupted from outside. Marcus pressed himself against the wall as bullets punched through the rotted boards. Wood splinters filled the air like deadly snow. Through the chaos, he heard Sarah's rifle crack twice in quick succession, followed by a cry of pain from the direction of the trail. "This is pointless," Harrison called from his hiding spot. "Surrender now and I'll ensure you both receive fair trials." "Like the fair trial you gave Thomas?" Marcus reloaded methodically, counting muzzle flashes through the walls. 3 shooters left, plus you. Odds are getting better." Sarah's rifle spoke again, and Marcus heard the distinctive sound of a horse galloping away riderless. She was holding her own, but they were still outnumbered. Harrison raised his rifle over the desk's edge. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Ilara checked her rifle one final time. Thomas stood beside her, his weathered hands steady despite everything they'd been through. The cache of Confederate gold they'd discovered beneath her grandfather's cabin had drawn more than just bounty hunters. It had awakened ghosts that demanded a final reckoning. "They'll come from the North Ridge," Thomas said, his soldiers' instincts reading the terrain. "Caldwell's too smart to approach directly up the valley." Ilara nodded, her fingers tracing the worn leather of her ammunition pouch. "He's been planning this for years, waiting for someone to find what my grandfather hid." She paused, looking back at the cabin that had sheltered them through so much. "I should have burned it all when I had the chance." "No." Thomas's voice was firm. "Your grandfather protected that gold for a reason. It doesn't belong to men like Caldwell." The sound of approaching horses echoed off the mountain walls. Ilara counted at least 6 riders, their intentions clear in the way they spread out to surround the property. At their head rode Marcus Caldwell, the territorial governor's man who'd been hunting Confederate treasures since the war's end. "Miss Blackwood," Caldwell called out as he reined in his horse, "I believe you have something that belongs to the federal government." Ilara stepped onto the porch, Thomas flanking her. "This is my land, Caldwell. You have no authority here." Caldwell's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Authority?" He gestured to his armed men. "I have all the authority I need. That gold was stolen from a Union transport. It's contraband, and anyone harboring it is a criminal." "Funny how that story changes depending on who's telling it," Thomas said, his hand resting near his sidearm. "Yesterday you claimed it was payment for Confederate spies. What will it be tomorrow?" The tension stretched taut as bowstring between the two groups. Ilara could feel the weight of decision pressing down on her shoulders. The gold represented more than money. It was the last connection to her grandfather's secrets, to the mysterious past that had shaped her solitary life on the mountain. "Give us the gold, and we'll ride away peaceful-like," Caldwell offered, though his eyes promised no peace. "Refuse, and we'll take it anyway, along with anything else we fancy." That was when Ilara noticed movement in the trees beyond Caldwell's men. A figure she recognized, old Pete from the trading post, along with several other mountain folk she'd helped over the years. They moved like shadows, positioning themselves with the quiet efficiency of hunters. Thomas must have seen them too, because his posture shifted slightly, preparing for action. "Seems you miscalculated, Caldwell," he said. "Mountain folk don't take kindly to threats against their own." Caldwell's confidence wavered as he realized they were no longer the only armed party in the valley. His men began looking nervously over their shoulders, sensing the change in dynamics. "This doesn't concern you people," Caldwell shouted toward the trees. "This is government business." "Government business ended when you rode onto Blackwood land with murder in your hearts," Pete's gravelly voice called back. "We remember what happened to Ilara's grandfather. We won't let it happen again." Ilara's breath caught. So others knew the truth about her grandfather's death. The network of mountain loyalty ran deeper than she'd ever imagined. Caldwell's hand moved toward his weapon, but Thomas was faster. The crack of gunfire echoed through the valley as both men drew and fired simultaneously. Thomas's shot found its mark. Caldwell toppled from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. The valley erupted in chaos. Caldwell's men found themselves caught in crossfire as the mountain folk emerged from cover. The battle was brief but decisive. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the surviving government men scattered like leaves before a storm. In the sudden quiet that followed, Ilara knelt beside the wounded Caldwell. "My grandfather wasn't a Confederate spy," she said quietly. "He was protecting that gold from men like you, men who would use it to buy power and silence." Caldwell's face was pale with pain and defeat. You don't understand. There are others. This won't end with me." "Maybe not," Thomas said, helping bind the man's wound. "But today it ends here." As Pete and the others gathered around, Ilara made her decision. "The gold gets distributed," she announced, "to the families who lost everything in the war, to the widows and orphans who need it most. That's what my grandfather would have wanted. Thomas smiled, his hand finding hers. And Caldwell? Ilara looked down at the defeated man. He rides out, spreads the word that the Blackwood treasure is gone, scattered to the winds, nothing left to hunt. The mountain had given up its secrets at last, but more importantly, it had revealed the true treasure Ilara had been searching for all along, a place where she belonged, surrounded by people who would stand with her, and a man who understood the weight of carrying the past while building something new. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Sarah and Jacob stood before the charred remains of what had once been her uncle's cabin. Smoke still curled from the blackened timbers, and the acrid smell of burned wood hung heavy in the mountain air. 3 days had passed since the confrontation that changed everything, since the mining consortium's hired guns had tried to silence them permanently. Jacob's shoulder still ached where the bullet had grazed him, but the pain was nothing compared to the weight of the leather satchel in Sarah's hands. Inside lay the original land deeds, the mining surveys, and her uncle's meticulous documentation of the silver deposits that ran beneath half the valley, evidence that powerful men had killed for and would kill for again if given the chance. "You sure about this?" Jacob asked, watching as Sarah knelt beside the foundation stones. Her fingers traced the carved initials her uncle had left there 20 years ago when he first built this place as a refuge from a world that had grown too small for his secrets. Sarah nodded, though her throat felt tight. He always said the land would speak its truth when the time was right. Guess that time is now. They'd spent the previous day in town watching Federal Marshal Henderson take the consortium's surviving men into custody. The trial would make headlines from Denver to San Francisco, but Sarah found little satisfaction in their capture. Too much had been lost, too many lives destroyed in the name of silver and greed. Jacob moved closer, his presence a steady comfort at her side. The auction that had brought them together felt like a lifetime ago, though barely 2 months had passed since that desperate day when she'd gambled everything on a broken soldier with haunted eyes. Neither of them had expected to find healing in each other's wounds or love in the midst of violence and betrayal. "What will you do with the mining rights?" he asked. Sarah stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "Sell them to someone who'll work the land respectfully. Use the money to help people like—" She gestured toward him, then caught herself. Jacob was no longer the hollow-eyed man she'd purchased that day. The nightmares still came sometimes, but less frequently now. The mountains had given him space to breathe, and purpose had given him reason to heal. "People like me," he finished with a slight smile. "Broken soldiers with nowhere to go." "You were never broken," she said firmly. "Wounded, maybe. Lost, but not broken." They walked hand in hand down the familiar path toward the new cabin Jacob had begun building on higher ground, safely away from the valley floor where the consortium's men had found them. The frame stood half-finished, sturdy pine logs notched and fitted with the precise care of a man who understood that some things were worth building to last. Sarah paused at the meadow's edge, where wildflowers grew thick among the native grasses. "My uncle used to say this land chose its people, not the other way around, that it would only flourish under those who understood its true value." Jacob squeezed her hand gently. "And what do you think its true value is?" She considered this, watching an eagle circle overhead against the endless blue sky. "Peace, maybe. The chance to start over, to build something good from the ashes of what came before." The sound of hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts. Marshal Henderson approached on horseback, his badge glinting in the afternoon light. Behind him rode 2 other men she didn't recognize. "Miss Sarah," Henderson called out as he dismounted, "these gentlemen are from the territorial government. They've got some papers for you to sign." The taller of the 2 men stepped forward, removing his hat respectfully. "Miss Morrison, I'm Commissioner Walsh. We've reviewed the documentation you provided regarding the illegal activities in this valley. The territory owes you a debt of gratitude." Sarah felt Jacob tense beside her. "What kind of debt?" Walsh smiled. "The kind that comes with compensation. The territorial government is prepared to purchase your uncle's mineral rights at fair market value, plus damages for what you've endured. It should be enough to build whatever life you choose. Sarah looked at the official documents, at the figures that represented more money than she'd ever imagined. Enough to go anywhere, to be anyone. She glanced at Jacob, seeing the question in his eyes, the fear that she might choose a life that didn't include him. Instead, she folded the papers carefully and slipped them into her pocket. "We'll need to think about it." As the men rode away, Jacob turned to her with wonder in his expression. "Sarah, that money could set you free." She smiled, reaching up to touch his face. "I'm already free. The question is, what do we build with that freedom?" Together they walked toward their half-finished cabin, toward a future they would construct with their own hands, one careful choice at a time.